So today we're going to be talking about freedom. And to introduce this amazing speaker, I wanted to open with a quote from a formative book that my English teacher gave me in high school when she found out that I was a feminist. It's A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, and the quote goes, "Lock up your libraries if you like, but there is no gate, no lock, no bolt that you can set upon the freedom of my mind." This quote is particularly relevant as I introduce today's speaker, the inspiring and thought-provoking Julie Walsh. With a BA from the University of Toronto and a PhD from the University of Western Ontario, Julie Walsh is now an assistant professor of philosophy at Wellesley College. The focus of her research is on the metaphysics and ethics of human freedom in the early modern period. If we're going to define freedom for now, and there are a lot of definitions, let us define it as the author of one's own actions. Professor Walsh pays particular attention to the notion of volition and freedom within the frameworks of Nicolas Malebranche and John Locke. Most recently, she's been working on how early visions of physiology, so the definitions governing human bodies, might have influenced our definitions of freedom. She teaches classes in early modern philosophy and ethics, including Introduction to Moral Philosophy and Early Modern Philosophy, as well as seminars that focus on philosophy in the 17th and 18th century. But it's important to note that she has a particular interest on women philosophers of this period. To quote Sarah Kasha, a close friend of mine and one of Professor Walsh's students and advisees, "What I really like about Julie Walsh, particularly as a philosophy professor, is that philosophy is supposed to be about loving knowledge, literally, and she loves all knowledge. Whether a student uses a relevant example from something from math, physics, art, film, memes, linguistics, poetry, whatever, she is so into it, and that's what we need from philosophy generally." She embodies that. So thank you very much, and welcome, Julie Walsh.
Oh. Thank you. What a delightful introduction, and actually inadvertent foreshadowing, because Virginia Woolf will come up later in this talk. So thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So how free are we? Sort of a big question. And I want to start just by talking a little bit about myself. So I'm a scholar of early modern philosophy, as you heard from Misha. I've spent many years working on theories of human freedom in the works of Nicolas Malebranche, John Locke, Antoine Arnauld. I've written and published many papers on these men's views of freedom. I've taught early modern and Enlightenment women like Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, Mary Astle, Mary Wollstonecraft, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, Margaret Cavendish, and others. But my research never really went in a direction away from the canonical or canon-adjacent male philosophers. I had never read a historical woman's writing on the subject of freedom. And then I saw a philosopher named Lisa Shapiro, who works at a university called Simon Fraser outside of Vancouver, British Columbia. I heard her give a talk on Gabrielle Suchon, who's the philosopher I want to tell you a bit about today. And Lisa's talk was sort of a broad introduction to Suchon's system. And she mentioned that Suchon talks a lot about freedom, and in particular, women's freedom. And I was like, were women thinking different kinds of things about freedom than the men that I had studied for so long? So I was used to thinking about differences in freedom as products of differences in theological principles or differences in metaphysics, never differences of gender. So I started reading and I realized, sorry, my exclamations are getting amplified here. So I started reading and I realized that actually, early modern women were asking and answering a whole set of different questions than their male counterparts. They were looking around the world and saying, so God gave everyone freedom, but here I am, I'm not free. What's going on? How can we fix it? So looking at what women were saying in this period, I think tells us about how they understood their own intellectual and moral lives in light of what more powerful people with greater resources were saying about women. It also gives us a picture of early modern philosophy that is more accurate. The more voices from the period we include in our research and teaching, the more we're actually doing the real history of early modern philosophy. So as I mentioned today, I want to tell you about one particular woman, Gabrielle Suchon, and her theory of freedom. And I think her theory is interesting because it gives us at least one woman's understanding of her own inability to effect change, both in herself and in others, and her prescription for how to modify her circumstances such that her power to effect change increases. So what I want to emphasize here is that when historical women wrote about freedom, what they were really talking about was power. And when they talk about power, they're talking about how to effect change in their own lives and in the lives of other women. Oh yeah, and this picture is just one of my favorite early representations of a man interrupting a woman who's just trying to work. Okay. So Gabrielle Suchon, one of a handful of women in the 17th and 18th centuries who was writing philosophical work about women and for women. We don't know much about the details of her life beyond the fact that she was probably sold by her parents into a convent as a teenager and ran away from the convent 25 years later. She petitioned the Pope to get her vows rescinded. He declined, and then she just escaped and found her way back to her mother and lived with her mother for the rest of her life, writing books, reading, and teaching. So she wrote two treatises, Traité de la morale et de la politique, Treatise on Ethics and Politics, and Du célibat volontaire ou la vie sans engagement, on the celibate life freely chosen. And these two treatises together total 1,200 pages, which makes her one of the first Western thinkers to leave a substantial body of work devoted to women's social, political, moral, metaphysical lives. Both her books were reviewed in popular academic journals at the time, but despite this, Suchon was, from what I can tell, not at all read in her own time and has been almost completely ignored in our own time. But her aim in her works, I think, is very relevant, both in her own time and for us today. So here's how she puts it. She wants to inspire women so that they might, this is a quote, protect themselves against servile constraint, stupid ignorance, and base and degrading dependence. Such constraint, ignorance, and dependence is vividly articulated in her view in the two paths open to women at the time: marriage and motherhood on the one hand, and the life of a nun on the other. So Suchon believes that women are excluded unjustly from freedom. On her view, women's relationships affect their ability to be free in ways that men's relationships tend not to. Women's relationships are often the source of the constraint, ignorance, and dependence to which they're subject. So women's relationships for Suchon prevent them from being free, which is to say, from exercising power. So her solution to this problem is radical, very radical for her own time, and still very radical today. Women must physically and ideologically separate from patriarchal structures. And I'll say a little bit more about what that means in a moment. So here's just an overview of the main points that I'd like to talk about today. And again, to sort of reiterate this extreme thesis that women's freedom can only obtain outside of the patriarchy. Now, of course, that's a little bit of an anachronism. Suchon isn't using the term patriarchy, but I think we can sort of read it into her system. Okay, so the first part of her argument starts with a more metaphysical basis about the kind of aspects of human nature that make all humans free. And this is one of the things that that can be kind of challenging in thinking about historical figures, especially in philosophy, that philosophy and theology for many, many centuries were pretty inextricably intertwined with one another. And so if you find the argument from the claim that God does nothing in vain not too compelling, maybe you're agnostic, maybe you're atheist, I think, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, I think we can kind of replace God in Suchon's argument with something like nature. And kind of think about the sense in which nature might ground our claim to freedom. But we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So God does nothing in vain. So Suchon wields this statement really, really powerfully in her first treatise. So she says, look, divine action is end-directed. When God does something, he has a plan. And women are created, women are rational, and so God's plan for women is for them to exercise their reason and to act in the world. A quick note just before we continue here, Suchon's discussion, or at least from what I can tell, there's no indication that her discussion is intersectional. So there's no evidence that when she talks about women, she means anything other than cis, white, European women. And the heteronormativity in this period is also very strong. So when she talks about women, it doesn't seem like she means all women in the way that we would mean today. And I think we can talk a little bit more, if you're interested, in how to use these frameworks that are very restricted in scope in their time, and how we can take them and manipulate them and apply them more widely given our interests. Okay, so here's the sort of general claims that she wants to start with. So as I said, God does nothing useless. God creates rational and intelligent beings for a particular reason, to do things that are rational and intelligent. Women are rational and intelligent beings. They're created thus to serve rational and intelligent ends. And so women have this natural, God-given right to pursue rational and intelligent ends. Suchon says, look, there's absolutely no difference between men and women with respect to the purpose for which they are created. Therefore, women ought not be excluded from the means to pursue these ends. But Suchon says, so society and culture seem to hold that women actually don't have what it takes to be reasonable, to pursue intellectual ends. Why is this? And she says, well, one main reason why my society seems to think that women can't do this is that men have always boasted of their advantages and privileges in all things. And she says men boast in this way on the basis of corrupt and extravagant opinions. This corruption, she says, comes from the view that men and women differ on the basis of their souls. But she says, look, the soul is one thing. The soul is created in the image of God, and insofar as humans have souls, they are the same on the basis of their souls. So God creates all souls equally, fashions them in his image and likeness. And once we recognize this fact, she says, we can do away with this corrupt and extravagant opinion that men's souls are somehow loftier than women's souls. Sort of an interesting note here. Suchon, in this discussion, refers to the book of Genesis and very selectively picks out the bits that make it seem like God wants Adam and Eve to be equal, and leaves out the bits that make it seem like Adam's the one who's in charge. So there's some very selective biblical foundations being marshaled here on Suchon's part. So she thinks, look, women have a soul. And again, here, if you prefer the language of mind, in the early modern period, most philosophers thought that mind and soul were synonyms. So she says, look, women have a soul, women have a mind, they have the power to act. And it's clear for Suchon that this power to act is tied to the pursuit of the ends that are suited to a creature with a soul, namely the rational ends of an intelligent being. And again, because it's wrong to prevent a being from pursuing its end, presumably because it's unnatural, it's against God's design, it's wrong to block women from knowledge. So based on these considerations, Suchon thinks, look, anyone who is blocking women from pursuing their ends is committing an offense against God and nature. So women ought to be able to access the means necessary to pursue their ends. This access to the means necessary to pursue their ends depends, says Suchon, on women being free. What does she mean by that? She thinks that to be free, to actually physically experience freedom, three conditions need to be met: knowledge, non-domination, and generosity. And I'll say more about those in a moment. Before moving to the first condition, I just want to note, so I've just used the word generosity. Of course, we all know colloquially what that term means. But the word generous etymologically derives from the Latin generosus, which means of noble birth. And Aristotle, well, anyway, I don't want to talk about Aristotle, but anyway, okay, well, we can talk about Aristotle if you want. Aristotle is sort of the locus classicus of this idea of great souledness and generous spirit. But by the 17th century, generous started to become untethered from this kind of class and lineage idea of being noble by birth, and instead started to refer to having the character trait of equanimity. So it doesn't mean generous in the sense that we mean it today. It doesn't mean of noble birth, but instead something kind of like large-spirited, big-spirited. And so it's in this way that Suchon uses the term. But again, I'll say a little bit more about that. Okay, so again, I think what's interesting here is that Suchon spends time, not a lot, but she spends time saying, yeah, we're all born equal, everybody is free, everybody has the right to be free. And then she spends the next 1,100 pages talking about the practical conditions that prevent women from exercising the freedom to which they are entitled. Okay, so first, what is freedom? She says this is a precious gift that is bestowed on rational and intelligent creatures, a gift by which they become mistresses of all their actions. Oh, mistresses! Yes, this is worth noting. This is translated from the French. Here, she uses the French noun créature, which is a feminine noun, creatures, which in turn makes mistresses gendered feminine in the English translation. And I think it's worth noting that it seems like Suchon here, there are many masculine nouns in the French that she could have used, like être, for instance, being, and instead she chooses créature. And so I think there's something, kind of feminized about the language that she is choosing to use in her description of freedom. So this is a gift on intelligent and rational creatures by which we can become mistresses of our own actions. And in fact, she thinks that freedom can be used in greater and lesser degrees insofar as reason determines our actions. So she seems to think that freedom increases proportionally with the knowledge that determines what we choose to do. So the more we know about what we want, what the consequences of our desires might be, how the world works, the more free we are. The more informed we are, the more free we are, she seems to think. So on this note, she says the first thing that we need to have to be truly free is knowledge. So we need to be elucidated by the lights of reason, which allows us to discover and come to know the importance, mediocrity, or triviality of our endeavors, the circumstances that ought to precede them and accompany the pains and difficulties that we face in executing them, as well as the joys and contentment that they can cause, and which makes us enter into the consequences, whether painful or happy, that might follow. For it is certain that without perfect knowledge of these things, freedom cannot be true. So Suchon thinks that without knowledge that helps us assess our projects, our interests for their relative value, and predict the affective consequences of our pursuits. So one thing to note here is that Suchon doesn't seem to be saying, well, in order to be free, you need to know, you need to have theological knowledge, and you need to have mathematical knowledge and philosophical. Instead, she seems to be focusing on, well, you need to know yourself. You need to have the ability to think about the things you want, to interrogate those desires, and have enough knowledge of how the world works to know the consequences of pursuing those ends. So it's a kind of practical knowledge that she thinks we need in order to be mistresses of our own actions. We need to sort of know enough about ourselves and about our place in the world, our interaction with the world. So this kind of knowledge allows for an analysis that allows us to kind of rank the importance of the things to which we're inclined based on how happy they will make us, how much pain or difficulty might be involved in executing those endeavors. And for Suchon, without access to the knowledge, this kind of knowledge, we can't be free. Why are women prevented from accessing this kind of knowledge? On her view, the obstacle is literally man-made. So the institutions and systems that have been put in place to exclude women, and the way that men have willed these institutions into place, she says, forces us to conclude that the ignorance of the second sex, women, has no greater source than the imperious domination exacted by the first. So throughout the early modern period, the second sex is the way that many women philosophers refer to women. And for any of you who are familiar with Simone de Beauvoir's groundbreaking early 20th century feminist book, you can kind of see the idea here is second, right? The second sex is under the imperious domination exacted by the first. So men build schools and they banish women from them, she says. As such, they violate God and nature by making it impossible for women to get the knowledge they need to serve their ends as rational and intelligent beings. So the second condition for freedom, non-domination, is met when there's no greater power determining the direction of one's will. So on Suchon's view, a rational being cannot submit to the dictates of anything other than her own reason. And to be under that kind of submission is inappropriate to her nature. So Suchon writes, the second quality that absolute liberty must have is the power to act independently and voluntarily, so much so that when a greater power prevents and opposes it, where the greater power obliges the power to act unreservedly and voluntarily to act, despite itself in the production of its acts, it ruins and entirely loses its being, which cannot subsist with violence and constraint. So in a situation of obstacle, opposition, obligation, any instance where a stronger force prevents us from doing what we will, we have no freedom. We cannot act independently and voluntarily. We find ourselves, she says, in an insupportable discomfort. So it's clear here that Suchon identifies interference, so somebody preventing us from doing what we will, from coercing us into doing something against our will. This is antithetical to freedom. And I'll just note, there's this kind of long passage where she uses this Aristotelian explanation for earthquakes as a sort of metaphor for what it feels like when you're forced to do something against your will. So the idea, the Aristotelians thought that like wind got trapped under the earth and then eventually the earth would sort of expel the trapped wind. And this is how she understands it, right? You're sort of like, or imagine like a kettle on the verge of boiling, right? To have your will forced is like being, all of that steam is being trapped inside a kettle and it's insupportable. There has to be a release at some point. But here I think interference alone is not sufficient to capture how detrimental constraint is to human freedom. So if we think that we're free just in case our actions are not interfered with, we might think that, for example, a wife can retain her freedom as long as her husband does not physically interfere with her voluntary actions. And this is a very, this is a very relevant example, and it's one that many feminists throughout the early modern period use, right? Can a wife be free even if her husband is nice and says yes to all of her requests? I think Suchon thinks we need more than mere non-interference. To be able to act independently suggests the ability to act in a way that's not subject to the permission, goodwill, or consent of another person. So to lack the ability to act independently is to have one's will subordinated to another's. In other words, to lack the ability to act independently is to be in a position of domination. So present-day philosopher Philip Pettit says, who's very well known for kind of elaborating some of these ideas, domination is exemplified by the relationship of master to servant. Such a relationship means that the dominating party can interfere on an arbitrary basis with the choices of the person dominated. So they can interfere in particular on the basis of an interest or an opinion that need not be shared by the person affected. So the idea here is that in this kind of dominating relationship, the person who gives their consent does not need to take into account the opinion, the desires, the wishes of the person that they dominate in order to decide what that person does. And it's important here to note that when we talk about arbitrary interference, this doesn't necessarily mean something capricious or despotic, but rather meaning that a dominating person has the power to interfere by their own discretion and without consulting the person whom they dominate. So no consultation is required. And for Suchon, submitting to the arbitrary rule of another is tantamount to what she calls servitude. So servitude, she says, is the greatest of all evils because it eliminates freedom and reduces humans to objects. And so I take Suchon to be asserting here that the state of servitude results in the loss of the ability to act independently, to act without asking somebody else's permission, even if that person is nice and almost always says yes, or even always says yes. Suchon writes that women are not their own masters because their actions are entirely subject to the inclination of others. So Suchon's point here is that so long as person, we'll say call person A, as long as person A's mood and discretion determines the actions of person B without considering B's interests and opinions, A dominates B. Suchon sees this kind of domination everywhere in women's relationships. So I take Suchon to hold that it's not the case that just freedom from interference needs to hold to be free, but also freedom from domination. So again, interference just means somebody not interfering with you exercising what you want to do. The additional bit of freedom from domination is not having to ask, not having your will subordinated under somebody else's, not needing permission, not needing the goodwill or desire of another person to execute what you wish to do. So women, she says, end up in states of servitude by birth in the event that a child inherits this misfortune from their parents. She notes that poverty is the greatest of all miseries because poverty typically puts people into states of dependence on others. But she spends most of her time talking about the domination that is involved in marriage and in the convent. So she says, look, marriage, we all know, holy divine institution, everybody's on board with that. But she says, look, married life is an affliction that arises from the dissoluteness and corruption of men. Marriage, she says, is a prison for women, and it is a state where true freedom is banished. Marriage, she says, is motivated by ambition, avarice, lust, rather than a desire to please God. So she says women have the worst lot in every vocation, but marriage is the worst of the worst. In this state, she says, women's suffering surpasses anything we can imagine. Life with a bad husband, she says, is a painful and rigorous kind of purgatory in its own right, if not sheer hell. Yeah, it gets intense, yeah. So why is it so bad? Okay, so a wife's pain comes from the fact that she must seek the permission of her husband before she does anything. She's dominated by him because his will subordinates her own. Suchon points out that the severity of one's master can change the intensity of the pain of servitude. But she's careful to say, look, even a kind and tender master cannot alleviate or totally eliminate the pain of this servitude. So again, even a gentle husband who allows his wife to do whatever she likes is still her master. In these cases, she is not independent, she's not free from domination. So what about the convent? Suchon holds that, again, like marriage, it's no doubt that this is a holy choice, it's a holy life. The true evil she sees in this vocation is that women, like her, are almost always forced into it. So to be forced into the cloistered life without a true calling for it amounts to a life of constraint. Being a nun requires following an ordered and solitary life. And she says, if that isn't what you want, or come to discover that it's not what you want, it's a life of servitude. So the convent, like marriage, she says, stifles women's innovations and initiatives because it's impossible for them to act without seeking permission from outside wills, from the people who are in power in these institutions. So any life where one is rendered dependent in this way, whether to a husband or a mother superior, self-mastery, the ability to independently determine your own movements and interests, is lost. In these situations, she says, the free use of our actions is impeded and forbidden. The will of others serves as a rule to which we must submit. So as soon as a woman speaks a vow of marriage or a vow of dedication to the veil, her will is no longer the authority over her actions. She's in a state of dependence. Okay, so knowledge and non-domination need to be joined by a third condition for true freedom to obtain. And so the last condition is generosity. So she says, we need freedom to be accompanied by fortitude and generosity, for many are elucidated who lack the capacity and the means to put their knowledge into practice. Others have knowledge and power enough to act and execute all that is necessary and useful for their perfection, but very few join to these two qualities the third, because fear and timidity serve as obstacles in the use of a noble and generous freedom, which cannot conserve its being and perfection except by destroying its contraries, namely ignorance, constraint, and weakness or timidity. Okay, so Suchon's telling us, okay, generosity, whatever that means, in order to get it, we have to get rid of fear, timidity, and weakness. So what does this mean? So she says, look, the people who have this quality of the generous spirit are happy. Why? They never use external objects to satisfy themselves, and they disdain the opinion of men and make themselves intrepid to all unforeseen accidents that constantly occur in the world. The generous person does not depend on the will, opinion, or the capricious and bad treatment of others. What I think Suchon is getting at here is that once we can shake off the constraint of caring what other people think about us, we will have generosity. And we will actually be able to perform the actions that reason tells us are good for us. So as long as we are ignorant, that is blocked from the first condition for freedom, knowledge, as long as we're under constraint, that is blocked from non-domination, the second condition for freedom, and as long as we're afraid, presumably of courting the negative opinion of other people, we cannot have generosity. And I think Suchon is suggesting that the first two conditions for freedom precede the possibility of acquiring the third. So she seems to be suggesting that it's very difficult to shake off caring what other people think about us or internalizing what other people think about us until we have a certain level of knowledge and until we have a certain level of non-domination. But meeting this condition, I think, raises challenges that don't arise in meeting the conditions of knowledge and non-domination. So for knowledge and non-domination, women must deal with the external forces that guard the domains of knowledge and that perpetrate domination. But the condition of generosity is one that is met by looking inward. So to attain the generous attitude, women need to overcome the fear associated with how they're perceived by other people and of tying self-worth to external objects. So for persons suffering under the oppression of sexism, which is the particular oppression that concerns Suchon, it's all the more difficult to become generous. The self-worth of members of the oppressed population is developed under the weight of the prejudice that they experience. Thus, coming to see the truth of their excellence is much more difficult. So while the language is anachronistic, I think it's helpful to think of the obstacle to women's attainment of the condition of generosity as a kind of internalized sexism. And versions of this phenomenon receive rich theorization in the early 20th century in work by W.E.B. Du Bois with respect to racialized oppression, and the late 19th century by Marx and Engels with respect to class and economic oppression. So for Suchon, freedom is given to everybody, but as a power that exists kind of only potentially, or at least in an imperfect state, until we have knowledge, non-domination, and generosity. When we have knowledge, we have a sense of who we are, what we want, what is good for us. The second condition yields circumstances such that there are no obstacles to the performance of the actions that are dictated by our rational natures. When we have generosity, we have a detachment of we can kind of see a detachment of our value from external things, including the opinions of other people. And once we kind of get this detachment on Suchon's view, we're happy. So to meet all three conditions is to live without external interference, without our will being subordinated, and without the pernicious effects of attachments to objects and opinions. So Suchon's clear, women are born for this. We are born to know, to not be dominated, to be generous. And we might think that her theory might be going in the following direction. You might think, okay, well, she's laying out all these problems, and now she's going to say how we can fix them, right? Here are the prescriptions for how to get things to be better for women. She doesn't. She doesn't argue in favor of reforming marriage or the convent, educational structures in order to allow women greater access to these structures. Why? She says, well, look, men find ways to disagree with one another on pretty much everything except one thing, that women need to be prevented from raising themselves up in any way. So she says, look, find any two men, they'll disagree, except on this one point. Women must be kept subordinated. So to champion or recommend any modifications to social, cultural, legal, political structures that would help women pursue knowledge would mean appealing to the very people who benefit from this structural injustice. So for Suchon, reforming the system such that women could better attain knowledge or non-domination is like asking a jailer for the keys to your own cell, in her view. When it comes to generosity, again, kind of trying to shake off internalized sexism, Suchon's picture is just as bleak. She says, look, women are complicit in giving away their own freedom. She says they are, this is a quote, vain, flirtatious, affected, fake, artificial, puerile. They gossip, they're greedy, they're petty. These behaviors, she says, provide evidence that women are their own enemies, opponents of their own freedom, and they manacle themselves. But she says, look, women act in this way because they conform to what's expected of them. These actions are the very chains that prevent their freedom. So just to conclude here, or to conclude this part of the discussion, access to knowledge requires that men open the doors to education. Non-domination means not being forced into the convent or into a marriage and living a life where your will is the master of your actions. But vocations are often chosen for women, not by them. And an aspect of the domination suffered by women is the very set of vocations offered to them. They may have a choice between the secular life or the religious life, but they themselves have not had a hand in the construction of their options. So Suchon says the benefits that men accrue in virtue of the status quo for women makes it very difficult that they'll give it up. So Suchon is very clear that in order for women to kind of break free from these obstacles, they need science, research, observation, experience. She spends several chapters talking about travel, that young single women should be able to travel the world and like meet different cultures and have different kinds of experiences. But her recommendation sends us in a circle because for the great majority of women, to secure access to books and experiences of the world, they need the permission of men. So can any of these conditions be met without the permission of those least likely to give it? The answer, I think, is no. And so Suchon's system cannot work for women. And this is because in order for the escape from servitude to work, there would need to be nothing less than a social, cultural, political, and moral revolution. And it's precisely this revolution that Suchon calls for in her second book, On the Celibate Life Freely Chosen. I did skip a slide, but we're just going to move past that. Okay. So in her second treatise in 1700, Suchon says, look, the free person is the neutral person. The free person lives the neutral life. So she says, she calls it the celibate life, the neutral life. Celibate for us has like connotations of virginity or a kind of refraining from sexual intimate contact with somebody else. That is involved in her definition, but her idea of celibacy is much broader than that. It means a complete lack of commitment and lack of attachments to other people. So the celibate lives without commitments, and this life has three components. You are totally indifferent. This life is consistent with what you want, and you have the resolve to continue to live this kind of life. And it's clear on Suchon's view that some women are intended for this life. Some women are born with the inclination to be a neutralist. It is clear that she thinks the neutralist is free, and perhaps only the neutralist is free, and the neutralist is happy, and perhaps only the neutralist is happy. So there are three important qualities of the neutralist. You are detached from the world, you are innocent, and you retreat. So a physical retreat from the world. When she talks about innocence, I think here she is talking about chastity. We can talk about this more in the Q&A. I suspect that Suchon might be more worried about motherhood here than about virginity when she talks about innocence, but we can talk a little bit more about that if you like in the Q&A. So the neutralist is separate from the world. She seeks personal tranquility. She serves the common good. She helps the sick. She helps the poor. She prays. She helps her community. She reads. She writes. But mostly she spends time alone. No one else tells her what to do. Nobody tells her how to spend her time. She's the mistress of her time. Okay, but what does this retreat mean? So she says, look, some neutralists live together in a community, some don't. Some neutralists are widows. When she talks about widows, it is interesting. So she thinks widows are the luckiest women in the world. Why? Because she says a widow, unlike a young single woman, knows what it's like to be with a man and is like fine with missing it. Whereas a young single woman might still be sort of tempted to kind of think about what that life would be like. So some neutralists are widows, some live alone, some with family, some are, she says you can be a neutralist in your heart, even if you have to still live with your parents because you're too young to be on your own. As long as your commitment to this life of detachment is strong, you're a neutralist. But she says the sort of classic idea for her of a neutralist is a group of women who live together with a deliberate intention to spend their life without attachment. So these women live together in a community and effectuate a physical retreat from society. So she says sometimes neutralists want to live alone, sometimes they'll live in little houses together close by, but they don't take vows, they don't owe each other anything. And she says, actually, there's a precedent for this kind of life because we see historical examples of communities in France and other places in Europe. Oh, interesting, Gabrielle. Say more. What does she have in mind here? She doesn't say more than this. But though she does not name them, I think she's referring to a medieval spiritual women's movement called the Beguines. So first appearing in the 12th century, numbers on the orders of hundreds of thousands of women within mainstream Catholic orthodoxy in northern France, Germany, and the Low Countries retreated from society to form their own communities. Like Suchon's neutralists, the Beguines were spiritual, but they took no formal vows. They were totally independent from domination of clerical leaders or family members. Some of them lived together. They worked to earn money. They were huge in the burgeoning silk trade in the 11th and 12th century in France. And though, the groups were sort of loosely associated, the common elements that rendered these women distinctive were independence, innocence, commitment to God, helping the poor, evangelical poverty, and, crucially, control over personal property. So one of the things that happened when women joined convents, when women got married, they had no control over their goods, whether it was physical property, money, other kinds of assets. So the Beguines, just like Suchon's neutralists, emphasized that women have to be able to control their property to be free. So there's lots more to say about the Beguines, but I just want to highlight the fact here that Suchon is obliquely, and they were deemed heretical by 1311, as is maybe no surprise. Eventually the church was like, these Beguines are these women who are making money and helping the poor and living without men, telling them how to interpret the Bible, how to worship. They're not having children. This seems very bad for us. So they deemed them heretical in 1311. So Suchon, of course, would be aware of that history, and this might be a reason why she didn't name them specifically. It's hard to believe she didn't have the Beguines in mind when she made this oblique reference to these historical examples. But I think what's interesting here is that Suchon is consciously modeling her system on the lived experience of what she likely took to be women like her. So women who looked around the world and saw that they were being blocked from doing the things they wanted to do, from exercising their power. So it's not clear which works by women Suchon had access to and read. And as far as a theoretical precedent for her views on the neutral life, it seems there are none. But there was a living historical model of the practice of such a feminist movement, the Beguines. So Suchon offers the theorization of the motives and circumstances of the kind of life the Beguines thought to live. So she kind of brings a feminist framework to sort of explain this historical movement. So the neutralist lives the neutral life because she wants to live in a way that conforms to her rational nature. I clearly thought this was so important. It is both numbers 1 and 3 on this slide. And the neutralist is free and happy. And as I mentioned, while she's not explicit about it, she seems to suggest that only this person who has effectuated this retreat is free, and only this person who has effectuated this retreat is happy. So I want to kind of transition to the concluding remarks here. So this idea that only the neutralist is free and happy moves her beyond what she says about the Beguines. So the Beguines, there's no indication that this women's movement was in part a statement of women's freedom and women's happiness. And so I think that Suchon's view rather foreshadows some more contemporary feminist writings. So I want to say a little bit about that. So as we've seen, Suchon thinks freedom is knowledge with absence of constraint and the elimination of the kinds of fears and weaknesses that lead us to form an attachment with external objects and the opinions of others. And when we're free, we actually are able to act consistently with our natures as rational and intellectual beings. So freedom is possible for the neutralist. What about everybody else? So she says, well, God calls some people to the life of a nun. God calls some people to the life of marriage and motherhood. And I think we can envision situations where wives and mothers and nuns are able to gain access to books and thus knowledge. But the attainment of the other two conditions required for freedom is harder to imagine for these women. So given that domination, even if it's acknowledged, accepted, and consented to, is the hallmark of both the secular and the cloistered life, it's difficult to see how a nun or a wife and mother can be free, on Suchon's view. So it's equally difficult to imagine how women can develop generosity while simultaneously performing versions of femininity prescribed by their cultures. So can non-domination obtain for a willing prisoner whose inclination is to be constrained? Can generosity obtain for someone whose identity is defined by external opinions and objects? In short, are the conditions of any vocation other than neutrality friendly to the development of non-domination and generosity? I think Suchon's answer is no. It does not appear that freedom and happiness can obtain, given present conditions, without a radical shift away from the institutions that favor men and imprint these freedom-restricting attitudes and ideas on women. Instead, she calls for neutralists to form voluntary societies away from the religious and secular societies to have space to pursue their ends. And I think in this light, Suchon's view is a kind of foreshadowing of 20th century lesbian feminist call for women's separation from society. So consider this definition of feminist separatism from the philosopher Marilyn Frye from the 80s. So feminist separation is, she says, of course, separation of various sorts or modes from men and from institutions, relationships, roles, and activities, which are male-defined, male-dominated, and operating for the benefit of males and the maintenance of male privilege. This separation being initiated or maintained at will by women. So why do feminists separate in this way or call for this sort of separation? She says it's for the sake of independence, liberty, growth, invention, sisterhood, safety, health, or the practice of novel or heretical customs. According to Frye, a feminist separates as part of the conscious strategy of liberation. And I think the parallels to Suchon's project here are clear. Like the separatist, the neutralist initiates and maintains her separation from the institutions, relationships, roles, activities that are male-defined, male-dominated, and disproportionately benefit men. The neutralist is motivated to do so because she wishes for independence and freedom, which it seems are made possible only by separation. So in short, here's the Virginia Woolf reference. Suchon seems to be calling not for a room of one's own, but rather a world of one's own. Suchon's close contemporary, Margaret Cavendish, who's pictured here, asserts a similar view. So Margaret Cavendish in 1666 publishes a novel called The Blazing World, the first ever science fiction novel. Amazing. And in this novel, in the preface, she says, look, I'm a woman. I'm not permitted to do anything. I can't rule, I can't be taken seriously, and so on. So she says, I'm going to create a world of my own in this work of fiction, The Blazing World. And in this work of fiction, I am a goddess, a duchess, an empress, a general, a war hero, a philosopher, a scientist, all the things. Yeah, I got goddess. Suchon is bolder. Her description of the neutral life is placed in a non-fictional world, this one, where she and other women can rule themselves. So Suchon writes about freedom in a way that would be, in some senses, familiar to her male counterparts. So we've got this idea that the metaphysics of freedom are grounded in God's will. We have conversations about interference and domination. But what makes her unique is that she considers these questions from the perspective of gender. So again, she looked around the world and said, everybody's telling us that human beings are made free, but women are everywhere in chains. So she asks, does gender impede free action? And if so, how can we change things so that free action is possible for women? So in answering these questions, she offers a radical and I think extremely unique view for the early modern period about how to do that. So from this perspective, I think an essential component of the history of early modern freedom is the history of feminist thought. These are not distinct fields that happen to intersect, no matter what people tell you, and they will tell you they are distinct fields. But no, I contend, right, the history of feminist work, feminist thought, is the history of philosophy. The reason why we don't read Suchon and other women is because of the devaluing and subsequent erasure of women's writing in their time and in ours. And the absence, there's an enormous dearth of women philosophers in philosophy, working in academic philosophy, I should say. And I think the absence of historical women in our field is a contributing cause to the absence of women in present-day academic philosophy. So Suchon took her position in society as a starting point for the theorization and diagnosis of the problem of sex-based oppression as it relates to freedom. And I think this is a lesson for all of us when we consider how to effect change in the world. So we have to interrogate our own position in society and think about the extent to which we're able to secure knowledge, non-domination, and generosity, and maybe other things, or maybe not those things, depending on whether you agree with Suchon. But something Suchon did not do, but that we must, it is urgent that we must, is listen to those whose experience, to those around us who experience oppressions different from our own, and hear how people unlike us are blocked from securing the conditions needed for freedom. And ultimately, we must act. We must act to increase the possibility of all persons to secure the conditions for freedom. So Suchon's prescription for action is extreme. No one is free or happy under the patriarchy. And so we must burn it all down, start from scratch. Maybe she's right. But whatever you think of Suchon's solution to the problem of women's unfreedom, it's clear that her view requires us to take action and effect change. So again, remember that for her, the rational and intelligent being is here to pursue rational and intelligent ends. So she is here to do something. So I began this talk by mentioning my own experience interacting with what people call non-traditional philosophers. That just means women and people of color. Reading Suchon and other women of the period pushed me to realize that I myself was laboring under the impression of lack of knowledge, of domination, and of internalized sexism. I did not have knowledge of the kinds of thinkers and texts that spoke to me and my experience. So I did not have knowledge because my professors in college and in graduate school never told me about them. I honestly did not know that women were writing philosophy in the 17th century. I was also under a kind of domination because I had to seek permission to pursue certain courses of study. So I wanted to write my doctoral thesis on theories of love and friendship in the early modern period. My advisor told me no. His reasoning was that these were women's topics, and I would be perceived as a woman when I tried to find a job. Odd that he was worried about that because I am a woman. But I suppose what he was worried about was that I would be perceived as just a woman, whatever that means. I also did not have generosity. I definitely experienced internalized sexism, both about my own abilities, but also about the abilities of other women. I certainly had the thought, it shames me to confess before you today and on camera, when I finally heard about women philosophers in the early modern period, I thought they probably didn't have much to say that would interest me because I am a classically trained analytic philosopher. What could they have to say that would interest me? So reading Suchon helped me to attenuate these obstacles to my own freedom. And it must be said that even her radical recommendation of separation for freedom has turned out to be true, in a way, in my case. I have more power, lots more power, than either Suchon or Cavendish. But even I had to come to a different world, Wellesley College, in order to do what I do. Here, I can teach and research whatever I like, including women's topics. No permission is needed, and it is not like that at other institutions. So Suchon helped me to recognize an important truth. In addition to these other truths, or, well, you'll tell me if you think they're truths. She helped me to recognize another thing that I think is really important. Freedom, or what most people call free will, is a complete lie, or at least a distraction. So as a final thought, let me tell you why I think that is. When philosophers talk about freedom, they talk about things like, oh, my will is what makes me free, or that my will follows my desires and beliefs is what makes me free. Or I've just put something else because there's like hundreds of views, and I thought this, for the sake of completeness, we'll just think of something else there. The first view, my will is what makes me free, is an extreme version of what philosophers call indeterminism. So my will chooses just in case it chooses. No other explanation is required. I am free if my will is what's driving my action. The second view is a version of what philosophers call determinism. So I'm determined, my will is determined by my beliefs and desires, but I'm still free because it's me who decides. They are my desires and beliefs, they inform what I do. I'm determined by them, but I'm still the agent, the driver of my actions. Here's the thing. Philosophers have spent lots of time, lots of ink, lots of thought hours, centuries, to fighting about the metaphysics of freedom. But to worry above all about the precise metaphysical details of freedom is to ignore, or perhaps more precisely, to be unaffected by the practical political details of freedom. If you already have and have always had political power, you are probably not terribly concerned about the conditions required to get it. Free will is a concept that is many centuries old. We are no closer today, even with the interest and work of neuroscientists and cognitive scientists, to figuring out what we mean by it. What Suchon helped me to realize is that the conversation we should be having is about power. Who has it, who doesn't, and why? In other words, we worry about freedom when we should worry about power. This is a lesson that oppressed members of society have been teaching us for a very long time, and Suchon helped me, finally, to listen. Thank you.